The night of December 18, 2010, settled over St. Louis County with the weight of midwinter stillness. Temperature readings hovered in the low 20s. A thin layer of frost crept across the windows of the great houses that lined the private roads winding through the old estate country west of the city. In this landscape of inherited wealth and generational silence, the darkness arrived early and stayed late. At Huntley, in a mansion belonging to August Anheuser Busch IV, the great-great-grandson of the man who had built an empire from barley and hops, a woman lay in bed. Her name was Adrienne Nicole Martin. She was 27 years old. By morning, she would be dead. The circumstances surrounding what happened inside that house have never been fully resolved. What is documented begins with a phone call placed to emergency services in the early hours of December 19th. August Busch IV, then 46 years old, reported that his girlfriend was not breathing. Paramedics arrived to find Adrienne Martin unresponsive. Attempts at resuscitation failed. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death, determined weeks later by the St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office, was listed as an accidental overdose, a combination of oxycodone and cocaine. The manner of death, accident. The investigation that followed produced no criminal charges. August Busch IV was never arrested in connection with the incident. The case was closed, and yet the questions did not close with it. In the months that followed, Adrienne Martin's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Busch, alleging a pattern of conduct that contradicted the official narrative. They claimed she had been given drugs while at his residence. They pointed to what they described as a delay in calling for help. They questioned the timeline of events as presented. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, its terms sealed from public view. No admission of wrongdoing was made. For the Busch family, the death at Huntley was not an isolated incident. It was the latest in a long sequence of tragedies, scandals, and misfortunes that had shadowed the dynasty for more than a century. There had been other deaths under unclear circumstances. There had been fatal accidents, bitter divorces, public struggles with addiction, and succession battles fought in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. The family that had once controlled the largest brewing company in the world, a company that had shaped American industry, American advertising, and American leisure, had by 2010 already lost control of the enterprise their ancestors had built. 2 years before Adrienne Martin's death, in the summer of 2008, Anheuser-Busch had been acquired by the Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate InBev in a deal valued at approximately $52 billion. August Busch IV, who had been serving as chief executive officer, initially resisted the takeover, but the board voted to accept. The Busch family, which had led the company through 4 generations, was pushed aside. The dynasty was over. The name remained on the cans, but the power behind it had passed to foreign hands. Grant's Farm, the sprawling estate that had served as the symbolic seat of the Busch Empire for more than 100 years, remained in family hands. But its meaning had changed. Once, it had been the home of kings of American commerce, a place where presidents visited and deals were made over glasses of the family's own product. Now it was something closer to a museum of former glory. The estate sits on land once owned by Ulysses S. Grant. The Busch family acquired it in 1903. Over the decades that followed, they expanded it, shaped it, filled it with European hunting lodges, and imported wildlife and symbols of aristocratic ambition. At its peak, Grant's Farm was not merely a residence. It was a declaration. It announced to the world that the Busches had arrived, that they were no longer immigrants striving in the new world, but rulers of an empire with roots deep enough to rival the old families of Europe. But empires do not last, and dynasties in the end devour themselves. The death of Adrian Martin at the home of August Busch IV was not what ended the Bush era. That ending had already come. What the death did was reveal something about the aftermath, about what happens to a family when the structures that once gave it purpose collapse. Without the company to run, without the throne to inherit, the heirs of Adolphus Busch found themselves adrift in a world they had not been prepared to navigate. To understand how this happened, how a family that once embodied the American dream became a case study in American decline, we have to go back. The story begins not in Missouri, but in the Rhineland, in the small German town of Kastel, near Mainz, where the river currents carried the commerce of centuries past ancient stone walls. It was here, in 1839, that Adolphus Busch was born, the 21st of 22 children in a family of prosperous merchants and landowners. His father, Ulrich Busch, dealt in wines and brewing supplies. The household was comfortable, educated, and connected to the rhythms of European trade. Young Adolphus grew up surrounded by the culture of fermentation, by the vocabulary of hops and malt, by the economics of production and distribution. But he was not positioned to inherit. In a family of 22 children, the youngest sons understood early that their futures would not be handed to them. They would have to be made elsewhere. In 1857, at the age of 18, Adolphus Busch boarded a ship bound for America. He was not fleeing poverty. He was pursuing possibility. The United States, in the years before the Civil War, represented something irresistible to young men of ambition and means. A landscape without ceilings, where fortunes could be built in a single generation, where the old hierarchies of Europe did not apply. He settled in St. Louis. The choice was not accidental. St. Louis in the 1850s was one of the fastest-growing cities in America. It sat at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, a gateway between East and West, a hub of shipping, manufacturing, and migration. The city's population was swelling with German immigrants, thousands of them arriving each year, bringing with them their language, their customs, and their thirst for the beers of their homeland. The market was waiting. What it lacked was someone ruthless enough, visionary enough, to dominate it. Adolphus Busch began modestly. He worked as a clerk on the riverfront, learning the supply chains that moved goods up and down the great waterways. He studied the city. He made connections. And in 1861, he made the most important decision of his life. He married Lily Anheuser. Lily was the daughter of Eberhard Anheuser, a German-born soap manufacturer who had recently acquired a struggling brewery on the south side of St. Louis. The brewery was small, inefficient, and losing money. Eberhard Anheuser had taken it over almost by accident, as settlement of a debt. He had no particular passion for beer. What he had was a daughter, and now a son-in-law, with very particular ambitions. Within 4 years of his marriage, Adolphus Busch had joined the brewery as a salesman. Within a decade, he had effectively taken control. Eberhard Anheuser remained a figurehead, but the vision driving the company forward belonged entirely to the younger man. In 1879, the brewery was formally renamed the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Association. The Busch name came second in the title, but it would come first in everything else. What set Adolphus apart from his competitors was not simply his energy or his salesmanship, though both were formidable. It was his willingness to think at a scale that others considered impossible. He understood, earlier than almost anyone in American brewing, that the future belonged not to local producers serving local tastes, but to national brands capable of reaching customers across thousands of miles. The problem was technological. Beer spoiled. It could not survive long journeys in the heat of American summers. Regional breweries thrived because they had no choice. Their product could not travel. Adolphus Busch set out to change this. He invested heavily in pasteurization, adapting techniques developed by Louis Pasteur to stabilize his beer for transport. He built networks of railside ice houses to keep shipments cold. He purchased his own fleet of refrigerated rail cars. He established a system of distribution that stretched from coast to coast, creating not just a product, but an infrastructure, a machine for moving beer across a continent. And he created a beer designed to be moved, Budweiser. Introduced in 1876, Budweiser was lighter than the heavy lagers favored by German immigrants. It was meant to appeal to a broader American palate, to drinkers who had not grown up in Bavaria, who wanted refreshment rather than tradition. The name itself was borrowed from a brewing town in Bohemia, lending an air of old-world authenticity to what was in truth a calculated American invention. The gamble succeeded beyond all expectation. By the 1890s, Anheuser-Busch was the largest brewery in the United States. Adolphus Busch had become one of the wealthiest men in America, a titan of industry whose influence extended far beyond beer. He owned railroads, banks, hotels, and manufacturing concerns. He built mansions in St. Louis, in Pasadena, in Germany. He entertained presidents and foreign dignitaries. He lived in every visible respect like a king. But the foundation of his empire rested on something he could not fully control: the appetites of a nation and the whims of its laws. By the turn of the 20th century, Adolphus Busch had constructed something unprecedented in American brewing: a national empire administered from the banks of the Mississippi. The numbers alone told the story. In 1901, Anheuser-Busch produced more than 1 million barrels of beer, a volume that dwarfed its nearest competitors. The company employed thousands. Its distribution network reached into every state and territory. Its advertising appeared on billboards, in newspapers, on the sides of buildings in cities the founders had never visited. Adolphus presided over this dominion from a succession of increasingly grand residences. In St. Louis, he maintained a mansion on the grounds that would later become Grant's Farm. In Pasadena, California, he built a winter estate called Ivy Wall. In the German countryside near his birthplace, he constructed a castle, a literal castle, where he entertained European aristocracy and indulged in the hunting traditions of the old nobility. The immigrant who had arrived with nothing but ambition now lived as though descended from kings. But Adolphus Busch was not immortal. In October 1913, while staying at his estate near Langenschwalbach, Germany, he suffered a fatal heart attack. He was 74 years old. His body was returned to St. Louis aboard a specially chartered ship, and the city mourned him with a funeral procession that stretched for miles. Flags flew at half-staff, factories closed. The man who had built Budweiser was buried beneath a monument befitting a head of state. The succession passed to his son, August Anheuser-Busch Sr., a capable administrator who had spent years learning the business at his father's side. The transition was smooth. The empire continued to expand. And then, 6 years later, everything stopped. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal across the nation. Prohibition had arrived. For the Busch family, the timing was catastrophic. They had built one of the largest brewing operations in the world, and now, overnight, their core product was contraband. The company scrambled to survive. Anheuser-Busch pivoted to the production of near beer, a low-alcohol beverage that skirted the legal definition of intoxicating liquor. They manufactured yeast, corn syrup, ice cream, and refrigerated truck bodies. They sold malt extract, marketed ostensibly for baking, but widely understood to be used for home brewing. The family did whatever was necessary to keep the infrastructure intact, waiting for the drought to end. It lasted 13 years. When Prohibition was finally repealed in December 1933, Anheuser-Busch was ready. August A. Busch Sr. had died in 1934, but his son, August Anheuser-Busch Jr., known as Gussie, was already positioned to lead the resurgence. On the night repeal took effect, a team of Clydesdale horses pulled a ceremonial wagon through the streets of St. Louis, delivering cases of Budweiser to the city that had kept faith with the family through the dry years. It was marketing genius. It was also prophecy. The Clydesdales would become synonymous with the brand, appearing in advertisements for generations to come. Under Gussie Busch, the company entered its most aggressive phase of expansion. He modernized production facilities, increased capacity, and launched advertising campaigns of unprecedented scale and sophistication. He purchased the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team in 1953, transforming the franchise into a vehicle for brand promotion and civic identity. He built Busch Stadium. He cultivated relationships with politicians, celebrities, and power brokers across the country. He made Budweiser not merely a beer, but a symbol of American life itself, present at ball games, barbecues, and 4th of July celebrations from coast to coast. Gussie was a man of enormous appetites and equally enormous contradictions. He was generous and tyrannical. He was charming and volatile. He married 4 times. He fathered 11 children by 3 different wives. He ran the company with an iron hand, tolerating no dissent, demanding absolute loyalty. Employees who pleased him were rewarded lavishly. Those who crossed him were banished without ceremony. At Grant's Farm, Gussie constructed a world that reflected his vision of himself. He imported exotic animals, elephants, buffalo, deer, and antelope, creating a private wildlife preserve that doubled as a public relations tool. He hosted elaborate parties for thousands of guests. He welcomed presidents and princes to his estate, offering them the hospitality of a man who believed himself their equal. But beneath the pageantry, fault lines were forming. Gussie's relationships with his children were strained by his domineering personality and his repeated marriages. The question of succession, who would inherit control of the empire, became a source of deepening tension. Gussie favored certain sons over others. He changed his mind. He made promises and broke them. The family that had built its fortune on unity and purpose was beginning to fracture from within. And the empire, for all its apparent strength, was more vulnerable than it appeared. Competitors were rising. Tastes were shifting. The same national market that Adolphus Busch had conquered was now crowded with rivals eager to claim their share. The throne that Gussie occupied so confidently would not remain secure forever. The land had history before the Bushes ever touched it. In the early 1850s, a young army officer named Ulysses S. Grant, not yet a general, not yet a president, but merely a struggling farmer trying to make a life outside of military service, acquired a parcel of land in what was then rural St. Louis County. He cleared timber. He built a cabin with his own hands, a modest log structure he reportedly called hard scrabble. He tried to farm the stubborn Missouri soil. He failed. Grant eventually abandoned the property, returning to the army and to the destiny that awaited him. The land passed through other hands. The cabin remained, weathering quietly through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the long decades of industrialization that transformed St. Louis from a frontier outpost into a metropolis. By the time August A. Busch Sr. purchased the property in 1903, The connection to Grant had become its most valuable asset, not for what the land could produce, but for what the name signified. The Bushes were not buying acreage, they were buying legitimacy. For a family of German immigrants, the acquisition of land once owned by a president, by the man who had preserved the Union, represented something beyond commerce. It was a statement of arrival. It announced that the Bushes belonged not merely to the merchant class, but to the narrative of America itself. Their fortune had been built on beer. Their estate would be built on history. August A. Bush Sr. began the transformation immediately. He preserved Grant's cabin as a relic, a touchstone connecting the property to its storied past. Around it, he constructed something entirely new, a vision of aristocratic permanence, rendered in stone and timber, and imported European craftsmanship. The main residence, known simply as the Big House, rose on a gentle elevation overlooking the surrounding land. Its architecture blended Germanic influences with American scale, steep roof lines, heavy masonry, broad porches suited to the humid Missouri summers. The interior featured wood-paneled rooms, stone fireplaces, and collections of hunting trophies, gathered from expeditions across multiple continents. It was a house designed to impress, to intimidate, and to endure. But the Big House was only the beginning. Over the following decades, the Bush family expanded Grant's farm into a self-contained world. They constructed the Bauernhof, a German-style courtyard complex modeled after the farmsteads of the old country, complete with stables, carriage houses, and a Biergarten, where guests could sample the family's products in an atmosphere of manufactured authenticity. They built the deer park, stocking it with herds of white-tailed deer that roamed freely behind ornamental fencing. They imported exotic animals from around the globe: elephants, camels, zebras, antelope, transforming the estate into a private zoological garden that rivaled any public institution. By the time Gussie Bush assumed control of both the company and the estate, Grant's farm had become something more than a residence. It was a theater of power. Gussie understood, perhaps better than any of his predecessors, that wealth alone was insufficient. Wealth had to be performed. It had to be witnessed. He opened the estate to the public in 1954, offering free admission to visitors who wished to tour the grounds, view the animals, and receive complimentary samples of Budweiser at the end of their visit. It was philanthropy disguised as marketing, generosity calibrated to build brand loyalty. Hundreds of thousands of visitors passed through the gates each year. They rode trams through the deer park. They photographed the Clydesdales in their immaculate stables. They left with the impression that Anheuser-Busch was not merely a corporation, but a benevolent institution, a family sharing its blessings with the public. For Gussie, Grant's farm was also a stage for personal mythology. He hosted parties of legendary excess, gatherings where politicians mingled with Hollywood celebrities, where deals were struck over bourbon and cigars, where the host presided with the easy authority of a man who had never known genuine opposition. He welcomed sitting presidents to his home. He entertained foreign dignitaries. He cultivated the image of a modern feudal lord, generous to his subjects, ruthless to his enemies. The estate reflected its master's contradictions. It was open yet exclusive. It celebrated American history while embodying European pretension. It projected permanence while depending entirely on the fortunes of a single company and the stability of a single family. Beneath the manicured lawns and the contented herds of imported wildlife, there existed a fragility that few visitors ever perceived. Grant's farm was not merely where the Bushes lived. It was the physical manifestation of everything they believed themselves to be. And when that belief began to crack, When the family turned against itself and the company slipped from their grasp, the estate would remain, bearing silent witness to what had been lost. The Walls remembered, even when the heirs chose to forget. The letter arrived in St. Louis on June 11, 2008. It was addressed to the board of directors of Anheuser-Busch Companies, InBev, and it came from Brussels. The sender was InBev, a Belgian-Brazilian brewing conglomerate that had been assembled over the previous decade through a series of aggressive acquisitions. The letter contained an offer, $65 per share for complete ownership of Anheuser-Busch. The total valuation exceeded $46 billion. For a century and a half, the Busch family had controlled the company that bore their name. They had survived prohibition. They had outlasted competitors. They had navigated depressions and wars and shifting consumer tastes. They had never seriously contemplated surrendering ownership to an outside entity. The company was not merely a business. It was an inheritance, a birthright, a trust passed from generation to generation. August Busch IV, great-great-grandson of Adolphus, held the position of chief executive officer. He was 44 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life preparing for this role. He had worked his way through the company's divisions, brewing operations, marketing, sales, demonstrating competence at each level, earning the confidence of the board, and finally ascending to the top position in 2006. The crown had been placed on his head. And now, barely 2 years into his reign, foreigners were attempting to take it away. The initial response was defiance. Anheuser-Busch's board rejected InBev's offer as inadequate, arguing that it undervalued the company and failed to account for its long-term growth potential. August IV positioned himself as the defender of an American institution. He invoked patriotism. He emphasized the company's roots in St. Louis, its contributions to the local economy, its identity as a symbol of American enterprise. The message was clear. Anheuser-Busch was not for sale, but the fortress had vulnerabilities that defiance alone could not address. The company's stock had been underperforming for years. Market share was eroding as craft breweries captured the loyalty of younger drinkers, and international competitors expanded their presence in the United States. Anheuser-Busch remained profitable, but its growth had stagnated. Institutional investors, pension funds, hedge funds, mutual funds held significant portions of the company's shares, and their loyalty was to returns, not to heritage. When InBev raised its offer to $70 per share in early July, the pressure became insurmountable. Within the Busch family itself, unity was fracturing. August Busch III, August IV's father and predecessor as CEO, had been pushed out of active leadership years earlier, but he retained influence and opinions. The relationship between father and son was complicated by decades of tension, by differing visions for the company, by the weight of expectations that had shaped both men's lives. Some family members supported resistance at any cost. Others quietly calculated that $70 per share represented a price they might never see again. The board met on July 13, 2008. The session lasted hours. Arguments were made on both sides. In the end, the mathematics prevailed over the mythology. The directors voted to accept InBev's acquisition offer. Anheuser-Busch, the company that Adolphus Busch had built from a failing brewery into a global empire, would become a subsidiary of a foreign corporation. The Busch family would retain no operational control. August Busch IV learned of the board's decision and understood that his reign was over. He had been CEO for barely 2 years. He would not survive the transition. Within months, he was gone from the company entirely, replaced by executives appointed by the new ownership. The Clydesdales still pulled their wagon in commercials. The name Budweiser still appeared on cans and bottles. But the family that had created these symbols no longer possessed them. In St. Louis, the reaction was grief mingled with anger. The company had been the city's largest employer, its most prominent corporate citizen, its source of civic pride. The acquisition was experienced as a loss, not merely economic, but cultural. Workers feared layoffs. Politicians lamented the departure of local control. Editorials mourned the end of an era. At Grant's Farm, the estate remained in family hands, but its meaning had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer the seat of an active empire. It was a monument to a dynasty that had lost its throne. The official narrative held that the sale was a rational business decision, a response to market realities that left the board no viable alternative. This explanation satisfied shareholders and financial analysts. It did not satisfy those who remembered what the Bush family had once represented, or those who wondered whether different choices, made years or even decades earlier, might have produced a different outcome. Questions lingered. Had the company's leadership grown complacent? Had the family's internal conflicts weakened its ability to respond to external threats? Had August IV been adequately prepared for the challenges he would face, or had he inherited a position without the tools to defend it? The answers depended on whom you asked, and when, and what they stood to gain from the telling. The official record tells one story. The silences tell another. In the years following the sale of Anheuser-Busch, journalists and historians attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to the dynasty's collapse. They interviewed former employees, examined corporate filings, and pieced together narratives from public statements and private recollections. What emerged was not a single coherent account, but a collection of competing versions, each shaped by the perspective of its source, each omitting details that complicated its conclusions. The Bush family itself offered little assistance. They had always been guarded with the press, preferring to control their image through carefully staged public appearances rather than candid interviews. After the sale, this reticence deepened into near-total silence. Family members declined to discuss the acquisition, the internal debates that preceded it, or the relationships that had fractured in its wake. The walls of Grant's Farm had always been high. Now they seemed impenetrable. But certain facts could not be concealed, because they had already entered the public record through police reports, court filings, and contemporaneous news coverage. These facts painted a portrait of a family troubled by more than business reversals. August Busch IV had been involved in serious incidents long before he assumed leadership of the company. In 1983, when he was 19 years old, he was a passenger in a car that crashed in Arizona. A young woman named Michelle Frederick, who was also in the vehicle, died at the scene. Investigators found that August IV had been driving at the time of the accident, though he initially claimed otherwise. He was never charged with a crime. The case was closed. The family's attorneys handled the aftermath with characteristic efficiency. In 1985, August IV was involved in another car accident in St. Louis, this one resulting in injuries, but no fatalities. Once again, questions arose about the circumstances. Once again, no charges were filed. A pattern was establishing itself, a pattern of incidents followed by legal resolutions that left the underlying facts obscured. Those who worked closely with August IV during his years at Anheuser-Busch offered divergent assessments of his character and capabilities. Some described him as intelligent and driven, genuinely committed to the company's success, burdened by the impossible expectations attached to his name. Others characterized him as erratic, prone to impulsive decisions, insulated from consequences by his family's wealth and influence. Both descriptions might have been accurate. Neither was complete. The death of Adrienne Martin in December 2010 brought these contradictions into sharp relief. The official finding, accidental overdose, provided a conclusion, but not an explanation. How had a healthy 27-year-old woman come to die in the home of one of America's wealthiest men? What had transpired in the hours before the emergency call was placed? Why had August 4 waited, according to some accounts, before summoning help? The wrongful death lawsuit filed by Martin's family alleged that August 4 had provided her with drugs and had delayed calling emergency services. These allegations were never tested in court. The case was settled before trial, its terms confidential. August 4's representatives denied wrongdoing. The Martin family accepted the settlement and retreated from public view. The questions remained, suspended in the space between accusation and adjudication. Investigators who examined the scene reported finding prescription medications in the residence. They noted inconsistencies in the timeline provided by August 4th. They documented details that suggested the evening had not unfolded as initially described, but their findings did not rise to the level required for criminal prosecution. The standard of proof in a courtroom is not the same as the standard of proof in the court of public opinion. August 4th was never indicted. He was also never exonerated. In the years that followed, August 4th largely withdrew from public life. He was occasionally photographed at social events, mentioned in gossip columns, spotted at establishments frequented by the St. Louis elite. But he no longer occupied the position of prominence that had once seemed his destiny. The company was gone. The public role was gone. What remained was wealth without purpose, a famous name without a clear function. Other members of the Bush family pursued their own paths, some more successfully than others. There were philanthropic ventures, business investments, and attempts to establish identities independent of the brewery that had defined their ancestors. There were also divorces, legal disputes, and the quiet struggles that afflict families whose cohesion has been shattered by conflict and loss. Grant's Farm continued to operate as a public attraction, welcoming visitors who came to see the Clydesdales and the exotic animals, and the preserved cabin where Ulysses Grant had once failed at farming. The tourists took photographs. They sampled beer in the Bauernhof. They departed with the impression that they had glimpsed something of the Bush legacy. What they had glimpsed was a curated surface. Beneath it lay depths that no tour guide mentioned: the accidents, the deaths, the settlements, the silences. The family had spent generations constructing an image of benevolent prosperity. Maintaining that image required not only the presentation of certain facts, but the careful suppression of others. The suppression was never complete. The contradictions accumulated, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. The years following the sale moved slowly for those who had once stood at the center of the Bush empire. Time, which had seemed to accelerate during the frantic negotiations of 2008, now stretched into long seasons of diminished purpose. The family remained wealthy beyond any ordinary measure. But wealth, as they discovered, was not the same as relevance. August Bush III, who had served as CEO for nearly 3 decades before passing the role to his son, retreated into the routines of a private citizen. He maintained residences. He pursued interests befitting a man of his station. But the company that had defined his identity, the company he had expanded, modernized, and defended through decades of competitive pressure, now belonged to strangers. His name appeared occasionally in news articles referencing the family's history, a figure from a concluded chapter rather than an ongoing narrative. His relationship with his son, August 4, had been strained for years before the sale. Afterward, by most accounts, it deteriorated further. The two men represented different generations, different temperaments, different visions of what the family legacy should mean. They had disagreed about strategy, about leadership, about the fundamental question of whether resistance to InBev was possible or wise. These disagreements did not soften with time. They calcified into estrangement. August Busch IV, stripped of his corporate title, faced a more difficult transition. He had been groomed from birth for a role that no longer existed. Every promotion, every assignment, every public appearance had been preparation for a position of authority that had vanished in a single board vote. At 44, he found himself without a clear function. The skills he had developed, navigating corporate politics, representing the brand, managing the expectations attached to his surname, had no obvious application in a world where the brand was no longer his to represent. The death of Adrian Martin in 2010 compounded his isolation. Though he was never criminally charged, the publicity surrounding the incident reinforced a narrative of recklessness and irresponsibility that had followed him since his youth. Former colleagues distanced themselves. Social invitations grew less frequent. The St. Louis establishment, which had once embraced him as heir to its most prominent family, now regarded him with wariness. The wrongful death lawsuit brought by Martin's family was resolved in 2011. The settlement amount was never disclosed. As part of the agreement, both parties committed to confidentiality regarding the terms and the facts underlying the dispute. The legal file was sealed. The questions that had animated public interest, what had happened that night, who bore responsibility, what the evidence actually showed, would never receive definitive answers in a court of law. Other legal matters surfaced in subsequent years. There were disputes over trusts and inheritances, the inevitable consequences of a large fortune divided among multiple heirs with competing interests. There were divorces, several of them contentious, involving allegations and counter-allegations that occasionally spilled into public view before being resolved through private negotiation. The family that had once presented a united front to the world was fragmenting into factions, each pursuing its own interests, each guarding its own grievances. Deaths also thinned the ranks. Older generations passed away, taking with them first-hand memories of the company's golden age, of Gussie's reign, of the era when being a Busch meant something beyond inherited wealth. Younger generations came of age in a different world, one where the family name carried historical weight but diminishing practical significance. They were heirs to a legacy they had not built and could not rebuild. In St. Louis, the civic wound left by the sale slowly scarred over. Anheuser-Busch InBev, as the merged company was now called, maintained a significant presence in the city. The brewery continued to operate. Jobs remained, though restructuring eliminated some positions and relocated others. The Cardinals still played at Busch Stadium, the naming rights preserved even as the family's connection to the franchise faded. Life went on, as it always does, accommodating losses that once seemed unbearable. But accommodation is not the same as forgetting. The older residents of St. Louis remembered what had been lost, not merely a company, but a sense of local identity, a belief that their city harbored institutions capable of resisting the homogenizing forces of global capital. They remembered the Clydesdales parading through downtown streets, the free tours of the brewery, the knowledge that something important was made here, by people who lived here, for reasons that extended beyond quarterly earnings reports. Grant's Farm remained, a physical remnant of the era that had ended. The estate still opened its gates to visitors each season. The animals still roamed the Deer Park. The Bauernhof still served beer to tourists who had driven from across the region to glimpse the vestiges of the Busch mythology. But the big house stood quieter now. The parties that had once filled its rooms with senators and celebrities had ceased. The master who had presided over those gatherings was long dead, and his descendants had scattered into their separate lives. The estate endured, beautiful and melancholy, a stage without performers. Grant's farm did not fall into ruin. That would have been a simpler story. The crumbling mansion, the overgrown gardens, the slow reclamation of cultivated land by wilderness. Such narratives are common in the literature of fallen dynasties. The great house decays. The heirs depart. Nature erases the evidence of human ambition. But the Bush estate followed a different trajectory, one perhaps more unsettling in its ambiguity. The gates remained open. Each spring, when the Missouri weather softened and the trees along the winding roads unfurled their leaves, the estate welcomed visitors, as it had for decades. School buses arrived carrying children on field trips. Families drove from neighboring counties to spend weekend afternoons walking the grounds, feeding the animals, photographing the Clydesdales in their immaculate stables. The Bauernhof served its beer. The tram circled the deer park. The gift shop sold souvenirs bearing images of the famous horses. From the perspective of a casual visitor, nothing fundamental had changed, but something fundamental had changed. The estate now operated under an arrangement between the Bush family and what had become Anheuser-Busch InBev. The Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate, which had absorbed the American Brewing Company in 2008, maintained a stake in the property's operation, using it as a venue for brand promotion and corporate hospitality. The Clydesdales, those iconic symbols of American brewing heritage, were now assets of a multinational corporation headquartered in Leuven, Belgium. They still pulled their red wagon. They still appeared in Super Bowl commercials. But their ownership had passed, along with everything else, to foreign hands. The family's relationship to the estate grew more complicated with each passing year. Some descendants maintained residences on the property or in its vicinity, preserving a physical connection to the land their ancestors had cultivated. Others had long since departed for different cities, different lives, different identities, unburdened by the weight of the Bush name. The big house itself, the residence where Gussie had entertained presidents, where generations of Bushes had celebrated holidays and mourned deaths and plotted the company's future, stood in a kind of suspended animation, neither fully occupied nor entirely abandoned. Visitors to Grant's farm encountered a carefully managed experience. The tours emphasized heritage, tradition, and the wholesome pleasures of a family outing. Guides recounted the history of the Clydesdales, the origins of Budweiser, the story of Ulysses Grant's cabin preserved on the grounds. They did not discuss the sale of the company. They did not mention the deaths, the accidents, the lawsuits, the scandals that had accumulated around the family over generations. The narrative presented to the public was scrubbed clean of complication, a fairy tale of immigrant success and American enterprise, ending not in loss, but in ongoing celebration. This sanitized version of history served multiple purposes. It protected the brand, which depended on associations with tradition and authenticity. It shielded the family from unwanted scrutiny, and it offered visitors what they had come seeking: a pleasant afternoon, a connection to something that felt permanent and reassuring in a world of constant change. The truth was more than most tourists wanted. The curated myth was enough. Yet the land itself retained memories that no tour guide could entirely suppress. The cabin where Grant had struggled and failed still stood, a reminder that this soil had witnessed defeat before the Bushes ever arrived. The deer park, with its imported herds, recalled Gussie's grandiose vision of aristocratic leisure, a vision that now seemed quaint, a relic of an era when American industrialists imagined themselves as New World nobility. The big house, glimpsed from a distance through the trees, suggested depths that the public portions of the estate could not reveal. Local historians and journalists occasionally produced accounts that complicated the official narrative. They wrote about the family's tragedies, its internal conflicts, its troubled heirs. They examined the circumstances surrounding Adrian Martin's death, the accidents of Auguste Dufour's youth, the bitter disputes over succession and control. These accounts circulated among those who sought them out, adding layers of shadow to the sunlit image projected by the estate's marketing materials. In St. Louis, Grant's Farm occupied an ambivalent place in civic consciousness. It was a source of pride, proof that the city had once been home to something grand. It was also a source of melancholy, a reminder of what had been surrendered when the company was sold. Older residents remembered visiting the estate as children, remembered the sense of wonder inspired by the animals and the grounds, remembered believing that the Bush family would preside over their city forever. That belief had not survived. The estate had. The grounds required constant maintenance, landscaping crews, animal caretakers, facility managers, attending to the endless needs of a property designed for display. This labor continued regardless of the family's diminished circumstances, regardless of the company's foreign ownership, regardless of the questions that hovered over the Bush legacy. The grass was trimmed, the stables were cleaned, the Clydesdales were groomed for their appearances. The machinery of presentation operated smoothly, even as the substance it presented grew increasingly hollow. What visitors experienced at Grant's Farm was not history, but performance, a simulation of continuity designed to obscure the ruptures that had actually occurred. The performance was convincing. It had to be. Too much depended on maintaining the illusion. And beneath the